big thing was that we had a television to watch the coronation on. Very exciting.
All the kids from all the houses either side of us all came and watched telly, sitting in a big circle around the television in our house.
Oh, that was amazing, because I hadn't seen telly.
I can remember the Queen with a tiny, tiny waist.
I think we had a huge respect for her.
And then we stayed in the Mall until everyone returned.
We had the massive street party and all the Union Jacks were hanging from the bedroom windows.
We had those kind of things, spam sandwiches, which we thought were exotic, you know.
And it was wonderful, amazing.
I didn't really know much about the King or the Queen and that sort of thing. Probably a lot less than children do these days, because nowadays they're fed by televisions and stuff, and all we had was the wireless. And quite often it was a wireless with a battery in, and you had to take the battery to the chemist to have it charged up, believe it or not.
This is London. It was announced from Sandringham at 10:45 today, February the 6th, 1952, that the King, who retired to rest last night in his usual health...
Well, I was at school in my classroom and the headmistress came in. She was a very dour lady and she never smiled. And we all wondered what we'd done wrong when she came into the classroom, and she announced that the King George VI had died.
I was at my first year at grammar school in London, and we were very worried because the head teacher came in looking very serious, and we wondered what we'd done. As in those days, obviously, you stood up when your head teacher came in. And she said, "Sit down, girls," looked very serious. And she said, "I'm very sorry, I've got some sad news to relate to you, that the King died last night in his sleep." And we all were aghast, you know, because the first very, very famous person that we knew had died.
So I knew he was a very important person. I obviously came home and said, they told us at school that the King is dead. And I imagine that they already knew.
I was at school, obviously, aged 8, just 8. In the classroom with about 40 other children, and the head teacher came in looking incredibly grave and sombre. We were all in silence because we knew something had happened, and after he'd left to do the rounds of the school, I imagine, the teacher announced quietly that it had just been announced that the King had died, peacefully in his sleep.
I can remember exactly where I was, just as with Kennedy dying, everyone remembers where they were. And I happened to be in a corridor at school and was very shaken by the death of King George, actually, because he had seen us through the war, and we all had a huge, huge respect for him and a realisation of his vulnerability, I think.
It was very sad because he didn't want the crown.
No.
He didn't want to be king in the first place, did he?
He wasn't expecting to be king.
No.
When the King died, I was just coming up to 14. I was at boarding school, and the house was called together early in the morning, and very solemnly the housemaster said, "The King has died." This came as a complete shock because we had no idea that he was ill.
I can remember feeling quite bereft, because I always followed the royal family, and I was really sad. And I even, in my scrapbook, have a newspaper picture of him waving the Queen, well, Princess Elizabeth off to her South African visit. And he did look ill then, really badly ill.
As far as I can remember, we carried on, but there was a sort of gloominess about the place.
So his death was all reported, obviously, as things were. And then the news followed the Queen's return to the UK as Her Majesty in waiting, as it were.
How much did people know about her at that stage?
They were the little princesses. She and Princess Margaret Rose she was called in those days. But she was probably not very well known as a person. She'd been in the ATS during the war, and that was said to be a very good thing, obviously, because she was wearing uniform and doing a job. She was hands-on, okay, so that's what we knew about her. And the empire was huge in those days, and so she was going to be Queen of the Empire.
Then on to the coronation the following year.
In the May before the actual coronation, we were asked to paint or draw what we think the coronation procession would be like. And so I draw the golden coach with just the Queen in it and just almost the back end of a horse, because I didn't leave enough room for the whole horse.
My father was an architect for the Ministry of Works and designed all the decorations along the Mall, and probably some others, but I don't know about.
I do know that Dad had been up in London, and he was part of a naval detachment that was marching with the sort of cortege. And I do know that he had to practice that lots of times, and they did it in the dead of night in London when there was no traffic around, so that they got it absolutely right.
On Coronation Day, some friends of my parents, that one of the daughters wanted to go up to see the coronation, and she invited me to go as well, and by then I was 13, and it was great to go up to London without being chaperoned by my parents. It was much more fun, and my father took us to the bus station about 4 o'clock in the morning, and then we got on a royal blue coach at Fareham bus station and ended up in London somewhere, and we eventually walked, which seemed like hours, to the Mall, and we stayed in the Mall all day.
I can remember getting up or leaving the house at 5 o'clock in the morning in my father's car with my brother and my sister and my mother, and travelling up to London from Redhill area, and we had to be in our seats, but we were behind a window in Oxford Street, D.H. Evans, and the company my father worked for had hired the window for the day, so all the VIPs were there, plus myself in my Clark sandals and short white socks, which were what one wore in those days.
It was very interesting because before the actual procession started, we got to know the policemen that were there, and they were very friendly and very jovial. And of course, in front of them were all the guardsmen being lined up, ready. How they stayed in one place for such a long time, I never know.
I was fortunate enough to see the procession live from a first floor window overlooking Pall Mall. My father, being a senior insurance manager, had been invited to join a small group of business associates able to watch the coronation from that vantage point. Why was I lucky enough to be in Pall Mall watching the procession live, although I didn't realise at the time how fortunate I was? I think that my father would have been invited along with the other business people to bring their spouses, and I think my mother rather nobly thought Cedric would like to watch this, and I think she stood down and allowed me to take her place. I wish I'd realised that at the time, and I would have felt more grateful to her.
And at the time I was living in Enfield in North London, and my father and I slept in his London office the night before the coronation. The problem was we had to be in our seats because they'd made temporary scaffolding type stands outside the Abbey, and we had to be in our places for 6 o'clock in the morning, which was a bit of a trial for me.
The procession, when it came through, seemed to take forever. Now, I was pretty blasé about the whole thing, as teenagers tend to be. I think my attitude was, the coronation, so what? I want to get back to riding my bike. But anyway, I watched it. It took a very long time. The Queen was in her state coach. She was enclosed, so we didn't really see her. We may have glimpsed her through the window. And then she was gone, matter of a few seconds.
I do remember the song.
In a golden coach.
It was a golden coach with a heart of gold that's driving through old London town.
Wearing her golden crown.
With the sweetest queen that you've ever seen wearing a golden crown.
And towards the rear of the procession were the Dad's Army of the Home Guard. And there was an ironical cheer for them, because they, even in those days, had rather the reputation of Captain Mannering.
Each side of the door by the Abbey, those covered areas, my father and mother were on the left-hand side. And they saw it and heard it from there.
We were in good position to see the dignitaries arrive.
My parents had invitation to it. My father was a senior civil servant, and he got the handout, and so there was great excitement about them going off to the coronation, and great talk about how were they going to manage for loos and how were they going to manage for food. Can't remember how that was worked out, but they were in the Abbey for about 8 hours probably.
We were living in Probus in Cornwall, and the big thing was that we had a television to watch the coronation on. Very exciting.
We had a television because my father had come back from the war when it was thought he was missing, presumed dead. So parents celebrated by getting a television.
Yes, half the village I think came in, but I do remember this television because it was quite small.
Yeah.
Because we were the only house in the street or lane to have a television, all the kids from all the houses either side of us all came and watched telly, sitting in a big circle around the television in our house. So we were quite famous.
I lived on an estate in Barnstable, and we were having a celebration tea in the afternoon, and the women were getting together in the morning to prepare the food, make the sandwiches, and there was one family on that estate, which was about 44 households, who had got a television set. So that was the house that the women decided that they were going to go to prepare the sandwiches. So they were the ones which actually watched the television broadcast of the coronation.
At the time was 9 years old, a 9-year-old boy, and probably not very interested really in that kind of thing. I was more interested in playing football or whatever outside in the garden. We crowded into the front room, which in actual fact is a room that us children weren't allowed in any house at that time. Very unusual, Sunday afternoons only. The probably 20 or 30 people in the room at the time, and the television was small, wooden, stood on the floor, wasn't one of these mobile things.
It was a sort of box with a tiny little screen, and I think my father was going round trying to get reception because it was awful. But we watched it and it was wonderful, amazing. I mean, I can sort of, yes, the anointing and everything, it was wonderful.
This was the first time that television had been used for a major outside broadcast, and it actually kick-started the whole mass ownership and rentership as well of television. I say rentership because it was quite common until relatively recently for people to rent their sets from people like Radio Rentals and so on.
We had a 12-inch television which my dad bought especially, and we had family coming up from Wales because they wanted to see all the decorations and things in London before that as well, and they stayed with us. And we sat round watching, and Mum got tea, and I don't think we left the television at all.
I was, of course, at school, at Kingsnympton Primary School. Mrs. Hobbs was the head teacher. I was 9, I was in her class, and she was one of the few people in the locality. She lived at Chittler Malt, and she brought in her television into the room, and about children and adults, about 40-45 people crowded into the room to watch television, obviously on one relatively small black and white television.
And the first time I saw television, because Mr. Hobbs, that was the school mistress's husband, set it all up for us. And that's the first time. Oh, that was amazing, because I hadn't seen telly. I mean, we had wireless at home, but not a telly.
The most fascinating thing for me was that they had an enormous piece of glass, and it sat in front of the screen, and it was like a giant spectacle lens, so that everybody could see the screen, which probably was 10 or 12 inches in size. So the picture was black and white and small and not a lot of detail.
We never thought we'd have one of our own, but there was someone in the neighbourhood who had one, and so everybody gathered round it. You know, it was an amazing thing. If you saw Downton Abbey getting a TV set, it was like that. And in most cases, people wouldn't have got a TV if it hadn't been for the monarchy, because everybody was keen on seeing all this stuff being played out.
We had a 9-inch television given by my father's boss, and we had people queuing up to come and watch it, and people pushing and shoving, and it was only a small room anyway, but yes, it was wonderful to watch it.
Television was bought for the occasion, and I suppose about 2 weeks before the coronation. Me, my sister and my grandmother, we watched it on the television. She was a bit of a stickler. Every time the prayers came or the national anthem came, we all had to stand up. She didn't, we did, just to be honest, to be patriotic.
We went into a neighbour's house because they were the only people that had a television. And everybody, all the relatives and the family and the neighbours and the friends, we all packed into one room and watched it. And we were there all day. I can remember the Queen with a tiny, tiny waist and rather large above it. Just a tiny figure in a beautiful dress.
Well, it was beautiful. It was black and white, and we saw this lovely coach, and the Queen looked so beautiful. Yes, it was also moving and beautiful, yes.
I think we had a huge respect for her. Princess Margaret already looked grumpy. She looked as if she was going to be trouble, and of course she was. But the Queen looked serene, I think I'd say.
I can remember the Queen Mother sitting up on the balcony with Prince Charles and Princess Anne watching.
I mean, I liked seeing Prince Charles and Princess Anne, and because they were quite naughty at the coronation, or at least one was.
And Prince Philip as well.
Yes, yes. And hugely handsome. I mean, he was hugely handsome. All my friends were in love with Prince Philip.
We stayed in the Mall until everyone returned, which I think most people have been standing for so long were quite grateful that we watched it all go, and we watched the Queen go past as well, of course.
When she was going back to the palace after the Abbey service, she didn't actually hold her orb and sceptre. She had a special unit built into the arm of the carriage that the orb rested in and the bottom of the sceptre, so she didn't have to strain her wrists.
And when it got to afterwards, it was pouring with rain. And I think the Queen went past pretty quickly, and you didn't see very much because it was a closed carriage anyway. And then everybody else had closed their carriage except the Queen of Tonga, who was a star. She was sitting there, short sleeves, waving and cheering everybody as she went along, and she must have got drowned.
Oh, yes.
Oh, the Queen of Tonga.
Well, she was huge and terribly ebullient and terribly pleased. And I can remember someone saying, "Who's that sitting next to her?" And the commentator saying, "I think it's her lunch."
And when the people saw her on that torrential morn,
I do remember the song about the Queen of Tonga who came to Britain on Coronation Day. I could still sing that, but I'm not going to at the moment.
She was the only one who wouldn't have a carriage, you know, the things put up, and she just got her umbrella out. And so she was a great favourite for the coronation, I remember that.
No umbrella, waving to everyone and smiling from ear to ear.
She insisted on having her carriage roof down so we could, all the crowds could see her, and that was brilliant.
I should never ever forget that view of her.
She went up in everybody's estimation, and never having heard of her before.
She was described apparently in the Times as the outstanding overseas figure of the celebrations.
Yeah, so it was very much a Commonwealth thing, because the Commonwealth was, well, the Empire was very important.
The other thing to say is that the whole nation was buoyed by the fact that on that day it was announced, or the news broke, that Hillary and Tenzing had climbed Mount Everest. It was the first confirmed ascent of the mountain. They actually reached the top 4 or 5 days before, and the news was actually withheld so that it could be announced on Coronation Day, and it caused, of course, a massive impact, and it buoyed the country terrifically.
And can you remember when your parents got home?
Yeah, they were knackered, obviously, but they told us all about it and found it terribly enthralling. They loved every minute of it and were very, very pleased to have an invitation.
But they never did tell you how they managed the loo.
They never told us how they managed the loo, no. Nor their sandwiches.
Till I was again with you. Let no other.
What I can remember is that we had the massive street party and all the Union Jacks were hanging from the bedroom windows. Everybody was excited and laughing, and we had spam sandwiches and jelly and a little bit of ice cream, and my mum did coconut macaroons and marzipan fingers, and it was very exciting.
And when you went out in the street, was there bunting up?
Yes,
parties?
yes, everywhere. There was a sense of community about it.
We didn't have a street party, but we have the most wonderful Trewithen Gardens, or Trewithen House, just outside Probus. And the Johnson family, who were living there at the time, had we had the sort of sports, we had all open, and it was a wonderful sunny day, and there were trellis tables full of food.
Well, we didn't have a street party because we didn't have enough children in our street. It was quite a short drive in Harrow. But my uncle worked for the railway, and the railway club had a big do, and I was invited to that. That was in Willesden.
I mean, we were still on short, you know.
Rations.
We were still on ration, so you couldn't buy an awful lot of goodies. Yeah, and what else did we have? Lemonade, but which was homemade lemonade, and yes.
Like Joyce, we had those kind of things, spam sandwiches, which we thought were exotic, you know. I remember my mum made a jelly, a green jelly, and a pink blancmange, which she put into a rabbit mould, which I'd been given as a child.
In the afternoon, there were races, athletics races, egg and spoon race, sack race, running, down at the top field as you go down the park just inside the gate. That used to be a football field, and it was actually done on the football field.
Oh, marvellous. Lovely day, yeah. And there was races, and I think my parents must have come up in the evening to collect me, because I sort of stayed all day.
For our housing estate where we lived in Newbury, we were told to dress up in fancy dress and go and be judged. And I and a girl called Sylvia White, who lived a few doors along the road, we were dressed up by both parents, I suppose, as the Bistow kids. You know, we were dressed up in scruff's kit, and we had a gravy jug that had steam coming off it when we left home, and we had to sniff it and say, "Ah, Bistow."
The next day, parents had a garden party, but it was in Windsor and on very heavy clay soil. It hadn't been a very good year, so the garden was a bit dull. So I had to go next door to Dodge's estate and borrow about 20 or 30 geraniums in pots and plant them in the garden and just make it look pretty. And the day after that, I go and dig them all up and take them back again.
As school children, we had all given a mug, which was the cheapest of the cheap.
I think we were all presented with a Coronation mug.
One was a silver spoon, and it had the Queen's head on it and mentioned the date and the fact it was the coronation. Then there was a navy blue tin of chocolates, which you could then use as a pencil case, I suppose, afterwards. And the third thing was a blue beaker with the Queen's cipher on one side and the badge of Berkshire County Council on the other side. We were all given those at school.
All the children of the village, every one of them was, we had to go up and collect our coronation mug. We were all given a coronation mug. And that was quite special. And
do you still have that mug?
Well, do you know, I've been looking for it and I can't find it.
I think I still have the mug. I'll have a look when I go home.
Yeah, I rather like my coronation mug because some of them have plain handles, but my handle was in the shape of a lion.
And have you still got it?
Oh yes, I've still got it. And my father's coronation mug from George V's coronation.
Dad came home and I think he gave Roland and me a coronation coach. It was made of plastic but made all goldy. And so we both, I think we had a coronation coach. And I suppose we were quite excited about it.
Then the week after, we got onto the train, the Cornishman or whatever it was from Truro. We went up to London and we saw all the wonderful pageantry that was down the streets everywhere, all down the Mall. And it was amazing. I mean, and so many people up there who had just wanted to be part of seeing the coronation after the event.
Gosh.
And I think we stayed up there, dare I say, in Brown's Hotel, which is quite, I mean, it wasn't in those days, but we stayed up there a few days and we walked around. And all the posts with enormous great, there were flags everywhere, and lights and bulbs and goodness knows what lit up in the evenings. And it was magical.
One of my memories is that a rare event happened in that my mother went on a coach to London to see the coronation decorations. It was noteworthy of two things. It was very rare for my mother to go on a coach without my father. My father stayed at home and looked after me. Unfortunately, when my mother was enjoying the sights in London, my father got a raging toothache and was not at all pleased that my mother was in London. And indeed, the moment she came home, he went into South Molton and had the said tooth removed without anaesthetic, I understand.
There was all sorts of things going on in honour of the coronation, and my father was the standard bearer of his branch of the British Legion, and he went to Hyde Park, and I've got the programme at home which came from that event.
And then must have been about a week or 3 weeks later, we had the Queen come past our school, so we were allowed to stand on the steps and wave to her. And I remember her looking quite petite in the car, you know.
All the girls at our school had to stand in a line by the side of the road as she drove past with the Duke of Edinburgh. And I remember she was dressed in a blue coat and hat, but she was gone so quickly. We didn't even have time to wave a flag, but I don't actually think we had a flag.
She came to North Devon, and I was in school at the grammar school, which is part of school now, and we were all walked into town, lined up along North Walk to watch as she went by in her car. And then I've been told, I don't know this firsthand obviously, but I've been told that the pupils from Kingsnympton school were taken down to the main road to watch her go by, and on her way to Egerton Forest, where she planted a tree, and there's a memorial stone still there.
And later on in that month, I guess, the whole school was taken to the cinema to see the film of the Coronation. And that's all I can remember.